I'm David. I'm one of the team of Cornwall Science Community. I'm going to try and be on top of the tech in this meeting. And just so you know, we will be recording this. So if you'd rather not be seen, then feel free to turn your video off or even change your name. Otherwise, we will have a section later on with some more Q&A, which I'll go over when we're closer at the point then. I will pass you straight back on to Robin then, who will be chairing this meeting, just like a more traditional cafe side talks, and who'll, play.
Okay, so it's over to me, is that right?
Right. Robin, take it away.
This is like the Pompidou Center approach to running a discussion. You've got to see that we have to show all the workings as we go along. Henry to everyone says, how do I access a recording? We'll be making the recording as we go along, and the recording at the end of the evening will be posted on our YouTube channel. And you need to give us 48 hours or so just to get the stuff up there. Now, some people will therefore have already recognized that there is a chat button. At the moment, mine is bright orange. I don't know where everybody's is. If you click on that, it will take you to a side panel, and there you can write, you can type in comments or questions as we go along. That said, the way that a Café Sci operates, the standard model, is that we start out giving our invited speaker the floor for a relatively short talk. We suggest a talk of about 20 minutes or so. And during that time, by all means, do think of questions you would like to ask. Start preparing your text even for the chat session. But we save questions until the end of the talk. And at that point, I'll then chair that part of the discussion as best I can based on the questions we have coming in. Sometimes complementing a few if several people are asking the same thing. Sometimes taking us on to further questions and trying to draw out the links in a host kind of way. I can explain a bit more about that as we get to it, because we may have other people arriving late. For the moment, though, let me just two things. Firstly, this is an experiment. This is our second attempt to run a virtual Café Sci, and there's lots of things we're still trying to make work. There's lots of things which are not working as smoothly as we want, and we are discovering as we go along what it is we need to do and how to do things better. So if anybody's had a frustratingly difficult time getting in, or if you do have problems, do let us know. Save those for later, for now, but do let us know, because that's how we learn to make this work better. That said, we had a great talk last week, and you'll find two videos, one a kind of animated cartoon version, and one the actual talk with the Q&A session included as well. And we do really recommend that you hang on for the Q&A session, don't just sort of get the talk and then dash off, because the Q&A is really the best bit of a Café Sci talk. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I now want to simply play host and hand over to our guest speaker for tonight, Ben Holt. Ben, probably best you introduce yourself, I guess. So over to you.
Okay, I think I've unmuted myself. Can you? Yeah, I'm seeing some thumbs up and some nodding heads, so that's good to see. Hi, yeah, my name's Ben Holt. I'm an ecologist. I actually started my research life as an evolutionary ecologist. I was studying the evolution of Caribbean reef fish, and from there, I basically, as part of that research, I ended up using a lot of data that's been collected by citizen scientists, and that was my first sort of introduction to the world of citizen science. And I put that data to what I think was quite good use, researching these fish. And it occurred to me that it's an amazing thing that thousands of people had collected these data, and we've actually used it to discover something that we'd never have known if people hadn't have just done all that stuff voluntarily off their own backs. And ever since then, and that's going back about 15 years or so now, I've got more and more into the world of citizen science, and to the point that over the last 2.5–3 years, I've actually set up a citizen science organisation from scratch, and I'll be talking a bit about that at the end of today's talk. So let me just get the talk up and running. Share screens. Let's have a look. Okay, so that worked, and give us some thumbs up if you can see the PowerPoint. Good. Thank you very much. Okay. All right, so the power of citizen science. So I've got my contact details up there. As Robin was saying, the talk last week, I joined in last week as well. Megan's talk, it was fantastic, and the discussion afterwards really was fantastic as well. If anything that I talk about today is something that you'd like to follow up on, please do get in contact. I've got my email address there and my Twitter handle as well. Okay, so today talking about citizen science, but I'm also talking about biodiversity, because that's the other big thing that I'm interested in. And this first slide is basically just having a look at what biodiversity actually is. Biodiversity, in one way, it's a real buzzword these days. You quite often hear people talking about we need to do this or we shouldn't do that because it's good or bad for biodiversity. And quite often people haven't really given too much thought as to what they mean by that. And you could really just substitute the word biodiversity for the word wildlife in that case. And perhaps there's nothing particularly wrong with that. The Convention for Biological Diversity has defined it this way. I'll have to shift that there so I can read it myself. Biological diversity means variability among living organisms from all sources. So quite often people look at it as being the number of species in a place, but it can be much more complicated than that. You can look at things like genetic diversity, and there's other sorts of diversity that I'll mention in a minute. One of the key things is we're talking about how life itself varies either across the planet or from time to time. We're not necessarily talking about the abundance of species, of individual species, that is. And this is quite relevant for conservation, because conservation has seen a sort of gradual transition over the past few decades, where it sort of started off by looking at species which were close to going extinct and trying to increase their population sizes. And then in recent decades, people have realised that things aren't as simple as that. You need to protect whole ecosystems. And to do that, you need to actually get a measure of what's in those ecosystems and how they vary. So there are different ways that we can actually measure biodiversity. The very simplest one is the one that I just sort of mentioned. It's known as species richness, and that's the total number of species. And because it's the most sort of basic measure of biodiversity, at the species level at least, it's the one that I'm going to be sort of focusing on today. But there are others. There's functional diversity. So that can be measured in terms of how many different sizes of species you've got, or how many different sort of dietary preferences, all sorts of different things related to what species actually do in an ecosystem. There's other things like evolutionary diversity. Instead of just looking at number of species, you can consider number of families, that kind of thing. And then probably one of the most important things is species composition. So if you look at an ecosystem or a habitat, instead of just asking, how many species there are, asking what actually are those species. You could have two sites which both have 10 species. They could be exactly the same, or they could be completely different. And we have ways of measuring that, which are important. Why is it important to measure ecosystems in this way? Well, there's two broad kind of reasons. I have to move my that there. That's fine. First, we've got scientific reasons. So ecologists, such as myself, we study ecosystems, but there are many different ways of doing it. Okay, so you can just it's working there. That's right. Many ecologists just work entirely theoretically. They don't necessarily work in the real world, so to speak, as well. They have ideas of how things work, and they articulate them. These can be tested in the lab as well, and then that can be also extended. Some sort of fieldwork settings are kind of controlled fieldwork settings. But eventually, we want to go and have a look to see what's happening in the natural world. So it's kind of like a big part of the general sort of ways of studying ecology, to be able to look and study what's happening in the real world, even though you can't necessarily control and answer scientific hypotheses. It's also important for conservation reasons. So if we're looking to conserve biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity in marine and terrestrial habitats is one of the biggest concerns of the modern age. We need to somehow measure what's going on in terms of where we get more species, where we get fewer, what species are where, that kind of thing. And biodiversity measurements give us a way of doing this. So this map, which I'm showing here, is a map of the world and coastal regions of the world, and it's fish species richness. So this is a map taken from a paper I was involved with a couple of years ago. And it's showing where you get more species of fish and when you get fewer species of fish. And we looked in our paper to see if the amount of conservation effort within these areas actually measured up to this pattern of species richness that we saw across the world. And what we found was there was absolutely no relationship. Here's a graph that shows that on the x-axis down here. We've got the species richness, the number of species in one of those areas. And then on the y-axis here, we've got the amount of protected areas in that particular zone, if you want to call it a zone. And there was no relationship as well. Now, we weren't saying that this is how you'd want to prioritise your conservation effort. We tried out a lot of other things that you might want to do, and all of them gave the same answer. Basically, people hadn't thought about this at all, and you might as well have just allocated all your conservation resources randomly, and you'd get just as good a result. But if you've got the data, you've got the opportunity to actually look at this and prioritise it better. But do we have the data? And this is quite an old paper, figures from an old paper by Mora et al. 2008. But I really like it. It kind of really demonstrates the point that I'd like to make when it comes to the amount that we actually know about the natural world, particularly the marine world. So what's happening here in this map of the world is the colour of each of the squares that you see gives you an indication of how complete our list of fish species is for that particular square of the world. Okay, so if it's green, we actually know 100% of all of the fish species. They've all been recorded within that grid cell. Okay, going down to red, where we've actually only recorded 1% of the fish species in that grid cell. And if it's white, we have no data for it at all. So it's over 10 years out of date, but it wasn't that long ago. And as you can see, with these really big 36-degree grid cells, there were 1 or 2 grid cells where we didn't have any data of a single fish at all. And it wasn't because there aren't fish there. There are fish there, but nobody had recorded them. Now, these grid cells are very big indeed, too big really to do anything useful with. Once you focus in a bit, you start finding a lot more red cells and then a lot more white cells. So there were no data points at all in any of these white cells, until the point where a lot of the open ocean has absolutely no data at all. So if you look at ourselves here in the UK, we still, even at this fine level, have a good inventory of all the fish that are in our waters. But elsewhere in the world, there are some places like that, but the majority of them either have no data or very little information. And fish are probably one of the best studied taxonomic groups in the marine world. So and there are many, many other types of species out there in the marine world, but we still really don't know a lot about where they live. So here's something I did in yesterday. So locally, you can find such a similar kind of situation. So here's a map of the Falmouth area and the records for any species that are on the National Biodiversity Network, which is our kind of central repository for biodiversity data in this country. And yeah, it looks like there are lots of data points. I suppose there are. But if you zoom in a little bit closer, you'll find that they tend out to be quite sparse. Each one of these points just represents one record of one species, or up to 9. The majority of them are actually one record. If they're yellow, that is. If they start slightly sort of more orangey or red, then there could be more, but there aren't many of them. there are lots of parts of the Falmouth coastline where we don't have any data at all. We do have these clusters here of a lot of data for certain sites, but all of these actually represent data that's been collected by just one organisation, and that was all from just last year. And we might be talking a little bit about that organisation a little bit later. So this has implications, as I mentioned, for conservation, and I put this map together last night as well to get an up-to-date view of what's happening conservation-wise in Devon and Cornwall. And yeah, I was quite shocked actually. So I mean, this slide's entitled "Conservation Gaps." You can't actually see too many gaps. This is a map of the marine protected areas of various kinds in our region, and it looks to me like nearly 80% of our coastline is actually covered by marine protected area, which you might think is brilliant news for anyone who's interested in marine conservation. But unfortunately, a lot of these sites, probably the main exception being Lundy Island, which is up here off the North Devon coast, which is a very sort of well-protected marine area. The majority of them don't have a great deal of protection at all. They've quite recently been set up, a lot of them, and it's still don't really have too many restrictions on what people can do within them. So I don't know necessarily if it's a good thing that we have so many areas that aren't doing a great deal, but I do believe that we should actually use these areas and try to actually put more restrictions in place to protect our marine environment. But we're not going to be able to do that for all of them equally. We have limited resources, and perhaps, I mean, the extent of them would suggest that it would actually be a very difficult thing to do. And so we should prioritise which are the most important ones, and that's difficult to do unless we've got good data to suggest what we have in each of them. The other issue is, I don't know about you, but I would say a lot of people out there aren't even aware that they are surrounded by marine conservation areas or marine protected areas, I should say, like this. And that may be related to the fact that people are slowly losing touch with nature. And quite often people refer to the Oxford Junior Dictionary, a lot of nature words being removed from that in recent years. This graph here is from a paper that took a bit more of a systematic look at that issue, and they studied the extent of nature-based words, not just in books, but also in songs and also in films over the 20th century. And they plotted that in the second half of the 20th century, there was quite a steady decline in the extent that people are referring to nature in popular media. And this ended, they finished their study at the end of the century, and things were still going down. And as far as we know, this situation hasn't necessarily been addressed in any way. So we have two broad issues, both of which can be helped out by citizen science. Okay, so getting people involved in collecting data from the natural world. It can both raise public awareness and it can look to resolve data gaps if it's done properly. So this is the organisation that provided the data for me when I was doing my PhD on those Caribbean fish all those years ago that I mentioned at the start. And they continue to be a real inspiration to me in terms of what they've done. So they've been running for 30 years now. They've collected, this is data just for their Caribbean region, but they're extending, they've extended all over the world, and they've actually been in touch with me just this week saying that they're going to be doing stuff here in Europe as well. They're a scuba diving based organisation. They just ask people to record what species of fish they see when they go scuba diving. They don't make it any more difficult than that, but they've been very successful. And over 5 million, I believe, records of fish species recorded just for the Caribbean, and 15,000 divers and snorkelers that have been involved. So a lot of them have actually contributed a lot of those surveys. Okay, so they have what's called the Golden Hamlet Club, and it's a lady called Cheryl Shea, who I was privileged enough to meet last October. She's in the Golden Hamlet Club. That means that she's undertaken over 1,000 of these reef surveys. And so this program has not only just generated a lot of data, it's generated a lot of experts when it comes to Caribbean reef fish. And they have a thriving community out there. They're based in Florida, but they also have hotspots elsewhere in the US and beyond of citizen scientists. So I didn't just do work on one particular group of fish, which is what I did when I first started, but I then took the whole database and I decided I was going to try and make the most out of studying biodiversity patterns using the reef data. And as somebody who's on the other end of the data, not collecting it but analysing it, it became apparent that there are also big problems, even though there are big opportunities involved in citizen science. So I'll just briefly go through them. I don't have time to go through how I dealt with them or how they can be dealt with, but I'm happy to discuss that afterwards, so please do ask if you're interested. So one of the big ones was unstandardized protocols. So I mentioned they just basically say, go scuba diving and record what fish you saw. They say record every species of fish that you see. Which has meant this program has been much more successful than other programs that have tried to get people to run transit lines and things like that, things that people don't necessarily want to do in their free time, basically. So it's a balancing act with citizen science. You can't necessarily make things too standardized as you would as a professional scientist, because you'll find that you won't get any data back because people won't do it. Uneven sampling, similar kind of thing. You can't necessarily tell volunteers where to go. So if you've got a particular island or something that hasn't been covered very well, there's no good telling people that they've got to go there. They'll go where they want to go. And variation among people. So this is probably the thing that people come to me straight away with when I talk about working with citizen science data. And when I say variation, they're saying that, you know, do these people really know what they're talking about? And I've sort of extended to that to say that call it variation amongst people, because a lot of these people really do know what they're talking about, much more so than a lot of professional scientists quite often. But then you do get people that are just doing it for the first time, never really taken an interest in wildlife before, and to be honest, some of their results can be pretty sketchy. So it's more of an issue that you have that variation than necessarily a problem of the overall quality of it. So when I worked out in the Caribbean for a bit, and that gave me the opportunity to look at some of these issues. So the unstandardized protocols, if you look at this plot here, the solid lines represent sites, well, different colors represent 3 different sites, high diversity, medium diversity, and low diversity site. And the solid lines represent surveys which have been undertaken by this reef method, so the unstandardized fund protocol. And then the dotted lines represent surveys that have been undertaken by a more scientific, what we call belt transects, so a method that professional scientists would more readily use. And we were able to find that actually we got similar results from in terms of how the sites compared with their diversity, the number of species that are recorded using both methods. But we also found that the more unstandardized protocols returned a lot more species. So if you look at the red line, there's the lowest diversity site using the reef method. That's that people actually recorded more species than the highest diversity site using a scientific, a more professional scientific method. So it actually had some kind of benefits. The uneven sampling was huge, and it does tend to be huge in citizen science data set. So here we have the number of surveys performed per site along the x-axis, and the number of sites that fit into that category on the y-axis. So we have a large number of sites that were only surveyed once here. That bar goes up into the sky. And then at the other end of the scale, we have a very few number of sites that have been surveyed to death, basically, way, way, way. And this creates a bit of a problem when you're doing the analysis. Obviously, if you survey a site many, many, many times, you tend to find more species than if you only do it once. And this is a problem that we need to address. Again, it can be addressed beforehand if you try to direct people, you know, to try and spread out their effort a bit more, but they're volunteers, so it's up to them. And this is compounded by the fact that this is in Caribbean coral reefs, but also in a lot of systems, including here, if we're doing our rock crawling stuff, for most natural systems, like, you very rarely get to a point where you stop finding species after you've done a certain number of surveys. It tends to go up and up and up. These are the two sites that have been surveyed the most in that entire reef database, over 500 times, and people are still finding species. So you need to try and find a way to deal with that uneven survey. Variability, I'll just show you this plot quickly that I actually put together when I was trying to look at see how much of an issue this is. I looked at every site in the database that I could and took 5 people. Well, I basically took 10 people from each site, split them into 2 groups, and I looked to see how many species each group recorded, and to see how well they actually married up if I used different people to record the same sites. And they actually gave us quite similar results in the end. There's a lot of variation, well, a fair bit of variation, not a huge amount. Some are way out there. This is a 1-to-1 line, so you'd expect them all to be along this line. There is variation, but for the work that I was doing, and that was to produce a map of species richness across the Caribbean, it seemed to be quite good enough. It does depend on the question you're asking, though. And this is the map that we were able to produce. And not only were we able to produce a map of species richness, we were able to look to see how this correlated with environmental factors and show that this is quite well correlated with the water temperature in the Caribbean. But only up to a point. So as the water gets warmer, you get more and more species up to around about 27.5 degrees, and after that point, it starts dropping off again. Which is roughly the point that the corals tend to bleach as well. So it was quite an interesting result. We published it, and I wrote an article on the Reef website as well for it. And it was really great, again, to see how all of that work could actually come together to find out something new. So that's a lot of my background when it comes to working with citizen science data, and it's really brought me into the world of actually getting involved on the ground and making it happen, and doing something quite similar to what Reef did here in the UK. So I, along with my friend from university, Alan Smith, who I believe is listening in right now, probably going to ask some ridiculous question in a minute, so we'll hear from him. Alan is, we both studied marine biology together back in Swansea in I don't know how many years ago now, I don't like to think. Alan went on to become a primary school teacher, and we both kind of independently had an idea of doing this kind of thing. And we met up, and we've made it happen. The Rockpool Project. Hopefully, a few of you based in this area might have heard of us and the stuff that we do. If not, please do go to our website. We've got a video which has been put together by one of the students at Exeter University, which brilliantly explains what we get up to. But I'll do my best to do the same thing right now as well. So we do fun rockpool surveys, basically, and once again, we are trying to keep the fun of getting out there and discovering nature, but at the same time give people the opportunity to record data that can actually be used to study the natural environment. So we call these biodiversity surveys, and we tend to focus on particular taxonomic groups because if we took a sort of a mishmash, as some people do when it comes to surveying rock pooling stuff, because you do get quite a few different taxonomic groups in rock pools, it's questionable how much biodiversity information you can actually get from that. But we study, we ask people to collect data on things like crabs or anemones, periwinkles, that kind of thing, and that can give us biodiversity patterns, if nothing else, for those particular groups. We also do mini bio blitzes, so these don't really give us the kind of information that I would need to produce the kind of maps I've just been showing. They are just free-form, so get out there and see what you can find. But they are still valuable data in some ways, that they can tell us, they can highlight if new invasive species have arrived, that kind of thing. And for the youngest children, sort of up below the ages of 8 or 9, we also have rock pool bingo. So we have ways of getting the youngest children involved as well. Hopefully, they'll continue to get involved in the stuff that we do in the future. We do this for a series of different events. We do provide events for groups such as schools and scouts and that sort of thing. We have public ticketed events. We would be doing this now, of course, if were it not for the COVID situation. And we also have private bookings, which we do for tourists. And part of the reason for doing these, particularly the private bookings, is that it provides us with some income, which will allow us to actually keep the project. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and the idea is that we will be collecting this data way into the future, and it won't be something that's funded by grants and then just stops at some point, and then all that work is difficult to do anything with it, basically. So we started collecting data last year, and we collected 169 surveys, 130 species so far, and 2,000 odd records. Not quite to the level of reef as yet, but of course we've only just got going. So we have ambitions in that direction. And the most important thing when it comes to our people getting involved in our event is that it's not just about taking part and contributing some data so scientists can actually just go ahead and use it. It's about becoming part of a community whereby we can all learn together about the natural world. And to do that, what we do is we make sure that when people have completed an activity and the data gets uploaded and analysed, we actually provide them with feedback specific to the data that they've just provided through the form of a PDF, which we email to them, which gives them not just the data that they've provided, but pictures of all the different species that they've found, and a sort of running commentary on the project and how they've just contributed to it. So that's a bit about the Rockpool project, and that's the end of my talk now. So yeah, please feel free to ask any questions and do get in touch if you'd like
to. Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. That's a really useful introduction to your subject. You're still sharing your screen at the moment, so presumably that's it. There we are. There we go. Right. Okay, folks. Now this is where we move to what I think is always the best part of a Café Sci evening, which is the Q&A, the question and answer session. Let me just remind you again, in the center, I think for most people in the center of the screens and underneath, I know every now and again some systems operate differently, you'll see a little square called chat. Mine suggests that there's 5 comments already in there. If you click on that, it will open up the chat screen to one side of Ben's face there. And there we start to get some of the questions coming in. If anybody is actually rather keen on appearing on screen and asking a question face to face, which is normally how things would work, feel free, please do. It's sometimes a lot easier to ask a question live than to write it out in a lot of whatever degree of technical detail that you wish. So if you've got a question that you'd rather put verbatim, should we say, please do just let us know, and then we'll come to you in your return. Otherwise, let us see, do we actually have any particular questions at the moment? Quickly running through, I don't see anything that looks to me like a question. Aha, right on time. Eloise asks, are there any opportunities to get involved with Marine Citizen? This was going to be one of my questions as well. Right now, during the COVID lockdown, is there something useful we can do in preparation or in... Ben, over to you. What can we be doing?
Okay, well, first of all, to answer from the point of view of the Rockpool project is something that we've been quite interested in, really, particularly because last summer we received some funding on the basis of our activities being exercise. And so we're not really 100% sure, it's difficult to be 100% sure, but we think that it is actually legitimate to do our surveys as part of your exercise. It's not some, they're quite short surveys. The surveys are 20 minutes long. So if I would say it really applies to people that can get to the sites easily. I guess the police wouldn't want people driving a long way to do it. But I think that it potentially is okay. The difficulty with this is in some ways, once you ask somebody, it becomes difficult for them to give you a yes or no on this. But we might be applying for some funding on that basis as well. So we will have to try and clarify that situation. We've been getting, in my household, we've been getting involved in citizen science in a new way by doing the BTO garden bird watch. So if you have a garden, I can recommend that. It's a weekly survey. So you just total up what you see across the whole week. So it's something that can keep you occupied and changes from week to week. So that's something I can recommend. There are plenty of opportunities to get involved online with citizen science under normal circumstances as well. There's quite a few sort of online systems where you can search for new stars and things like that. So there are plenty of opportunities, but hopefully there are opportunities with our organisation as well, if that's something you'd be interested in.
Okay, we will be having a talk coming up in a couple of weeks' time as well on insects. And so anybody with a garden, for that matter, anybody with a potted plant on a balcony, there are interesting things we can look at. But it does help to have a few pointers to someone to suggest particular things that we might want to look for, so that we can be more systematic in doing this together. Is there any way that you could suggest us particular places or particular things to look for, or are we not at that stage yet?
You mean for different citizen science opportunities? I'm not quite sure. I'll follow your question.
Yeah, is there a way that we can organise this a little bit for those of us who can get out for a walk?
I see.
Part of our healthy activity. Could there be a particular useful task that we could be participating in?
I think that most of the, if you're talking about the terrestrial side of things, most developed citizen science stuff, you've got a few with the ISPB and the BTO for bird watching. You have the butterfly and ladybird stuff it's good to get involved with. The butterfly count's been going for a long time. They're the ones that spring to mind. Yeah, I can't think of any others at the moment, I'm afraid.
Okay, we can come back to this in a little while, because as you'll have gathered, citizen science is something we're very keen to promote, and particularly looking at insects and the kind of urban buzz stuff that Falmouth, Truro, Wadebridge and St Austell have been involved in. This is something we want to actually have a talk on at some point. Mm-hmm. Moving on though, let's have one. We have one more question. Hi Ben, great talk. Thanks, says Joji. For Falmouth, where are you in the survey number versus species number curve? Have we found
all the species yet? That is a good question.
Unknowns are there, yeah. But do we know where we're at there?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly, but I would say we're roughly halfway there for Falmouth. I've not looked at a curve specifically for Falmouth, which sounds like we've made some decent progress, but it's the second half that takes forever, basically. The first half will usually be accumulated quite quickly. And so we found, I would say, most of the beaches that you'll find around Cornwall, particularly on this side of Cornwall, provided they're a decent size, will have at least 200 species in total of various kinds. And for most of our data sets within each site, we don't really have anything near that. I'd say probably around about 30 to 40 are most surveyed sites. But across a lot of them, as I say, we've recorded 130 species across all of our sites. A lot of our surveys have been in the Falmouth area because that's where we're based. So we must be around about halfway there, I'd say. But it will take us the rest of our lives to get to 100%.
Yeah, okay. And then it will change anyway.
Yes, indeed. It's always changing.
Okay, we have the kind of question I absolutely love. Somebody called Milo is asking about barnacles, working on a homeschool project, and is wondering, could you tell us how barnacles eat?
Yes.
And if you've done studies on them in the local area.
Okay, well, thank you, Milo, for your question. I've not done studies on barnacles at all, but I do know a little bit about them. So barnacles are filter feeders. So when you see a barnacle outside of the water, it looks like it's not doing very much at all, really. I mean, a lot of people don't even notice them. but when they're covered up by the water, then they come to life. And what you'll see is their shells will open up, and what will come out looks like a feather. But it's actually the barnacle's foot. So their foot is very feather-shaped, and they will beat in the water like that, and they will grab basically whatever they can out of the water. They're what's called filter feeders, and that's how they feed. The barnacles, they start off life as plankton. You might have heard of plankton before, Milo. You seem like sort of person that would have. And then they settle from the plankton on a rock, and when they do that, they stick their head on the rock, and they spend the rest of their lives upside down and using their feet to eat. So, yes, I know that much about barnacles.
I'm interested that you call it a foot rather than a hand. I mean,
well,
if it's shuffling stuff towards its mouth, is that not?
Well, I don't know why they call it a foot, but that's what they always refer it to as. So I guess it must be just a rear appendage that evolves, that changes in the metamorphoses to form that purpose.
So what's in the name then?
Yes.
Okay, now we have somebody has raised a hand. Somebody called Mahira has raised a hand. Does that mean does that mean that you would like to ask a question, or are you happy to come on screen?
I can ask a question.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
All right. So thank you for the lovely talk. I'm joining you guys from Karachi, Pakistan.
Oh, that's amazing. Cool.
Brilliant.
And I follow a lot of accounts like yours on Twitter, and I see a lot of the citizen science being done in the UK. In Pakistan, I've not really heard of any citizen science project, and I'm interested to start one in my city, Karachi, which is a city of 25 million people by the sea. So your rock pool project sounds very interesting. We have a beach here that really everyone goes to, and everyone has a smartphone, and I was wondering, there are a lot of species there. If I want to initiate such a project, what would be a good tool to use? I'm not a scientist myself. I have studied biology, but what would you recommend that people use? Because everyone is taking pictures at the beach. There are marine organisms there. And then how does one analyze the data, like not being a scientist yourself? Or do you worry about that later?
The more you worry about it before, the better it's all going to turn out. The way that I've set up the data collection on the Rockpool project, it's been shaped by my experience of analysing the data in the past. So we've kept it quite fun, and people are doing very similar things to what they would be doing anyway, going rock pooling, taking pictures of stuff. But there are certain things that we do to make sure that the data can be more useful. Certainly, keep on using smartphones. We use smartphones. That's how we have our own devices that we give people on our activities. So we lend them to people. They take the pictures, and then they give them back to us at the end, and then we upload those images. We tag them with the name of the species, and then that's our data set. So I think that that's one of the advantages of the modern age is being able to get that information so easily. I think the big things I would say is we have our designated sites. So we have we've now got about 25, I think, across Devon and Cornwall of maps of sites for people to do surveys. So when somebody goes to a survey, they go to one of these sites, and it's got boundaries on a map. So they are always surveying exactly the same site. If you don't do that, and you just say to people, just go out there and take pictures wherever, then it's much more difficult to actually analyse, compare areas. You have to do that afterwards, and it's very messy. So I do that. And the other thing that we do is we tell people to spend the same amount of time every time they do a survey, so just 20 minutes. So they time themselves, and so we know that they're doing it in a fairly standardised way every time. We don't put too much on them because, as I mentioned in the talk, that can put people off. But you need to control it to a certain extent, otherwise you do just get a mess that people can't really do anything with.
Thank you.
No problem at all. And feel free to drop me a line if you're going to go ahead and do this. I'd be really happy to give you some more advice and if that's useful for you.
All right, I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mahira, very much for coming in there. We've been wanting to get out of Falmouth and have a broader scale, but I have to say I'd never expected a question from Karachi. It's delightful to have you here. Okay, I'm going to motor on through because we have a couple more questions that have come up. Megan is asking, do we think lockdown will benefit our local and broader marine wildlife by lowering human activity? What kind of speed of response, what kind of response do you think we might hope for, and how would we know?
Well, I think focusing just initially on the intertidal, the rockpool wildlife, I think that they will see a benefit. People have studied, and a lot of people are concerned about the impact of people getting out there and disturbing the wildlife. In terms of how substantial that benefit will be, I'll personally be a little bit dubious, but you would be able to notice it, particularly for the more sort of fragile and vulnerable species. As far as I know, there hasn't been any reduction in fishing, which is probably one of the most detrimental things when it comes to the marine environment generally. The other thing I would say would be pollution, of course. And I know that there's been a big reduction in air pollution because of the lockdown. But when we're talking about things like nutrient pollution into the water systems, I don't think that's changed much either. So I'm not sure how much a broader impact it will have in the marine environment. So it seems to, I don't know if I'm just noticing wildlife more while during the lockdown, but it does terrestrially, I think it's had more of an impact.
And I would guess the water's edge environment is more affected by the waves than by anything else, the waves and the tides. And that's not going to change with lockdown.
Yeah. So under natural circumstances, the dominant things, as you say, are the amounts of exposure, as we call it. So the sites that we have on the north coast tend to be quite different in terms of what species we find there than down here on the south coast, just because they're much more exposed. And then the tidal range will have a big effect as well, or what the tide happens to do. But humans can have a big impact as well. One of the biggest things that people are doing as far as the rockpool, the intertidal regions are concerned, is putting up sea defences. So the sea levels are rising, and that's happening at quite a fast rate. And if there are sea defences there, then there's no new habitat for that whole intertidal, the area between high and low tide, to shift up the coastline. That doesn't happen. It just gets squeezed up into a seawall. That's there. So on a slightly longer term, but the humans do have a big impact on these environments as well.
Okay, we got a couple questions about the Johari's window comment that you began with about the known unknowns and the unknown knowns.
Yes.
David, who is one of our Cornwall Science Community committee members, how do we know how many species are still actually left to find in various locations? Can we really separate a habitat where there are species we haven't found from one where there just isn't much diversity in the first place? How do we know which it is we're finding?
Okay, so the short answer is that we don't know, because if we did know, then we would have found them all. So the study which I showed and similar studies, they're based on estimates, and the way they get estimates of how many species there are in total based on how many have been found up until now, is that they produce graphs similar to a few that I showed in that talk of how the number of species accumulates over the number of surveys or the number of records have come in. So they do the same thing. They go up quite fast at first to varying extents, and then they start to level out. So once you've got enough data along that curve, even though you don't know exactly where the curve's going to end up, you've got a line that you can then model, and then you can extrapolate beyond there and get an estimate of where it would end up if you're able to survey infinite. And there are literally hundreds of different ways that various mathematicians have come up with to do that. I had a good look at them as part of my research for that Caribbean stuff, and I think they have problems, but that's how the people did it. So basically, when they know to get an estimate of where you are on that curve, you look at the estimate of how many there are in total, and then you just look at how many you really recorded to get that estimate.
Okay, we've another question coming up from your school or university, Pavel. I'm going to because there's one. Sorry, Alan, but one more question coming up in relation to the same issue about the Johari's window question. Your map showed, based on where there is data known to scientists, what's been properly mapped and graphed, your map showed where we know there are unknowns, where we know there have not been surveys.
Mm-hmm.
But part of Johari's window is also about all the unknown knowns, the things that actually are known to somebody, but they're not gathered in any systematic way. Now that strikes me as being exactly the kind of territory, population, that citizen science wants to tap into. So on the one hand, there's an enormous amount of knowledge out there amongst people who know their environment, maybe they know their fisheries or whatever. On the one hand, to get together, to turn that data into stuff that's known to science, they would need to be motivated, but also there would need to be somewhere where you can send that information to, where it's catalogued and verified and so on. That seems to me to be a huge challenge globally.
Yep.
But even here locally in Cornwall, are there steps we can take towards producing a place that people can send in the information they have?
Yeah, I mean, these places already exist. So on a global scale, the organisation is called GBIF, and that's the global, so I don't know what, I think it's Global Biodiversity Information Facility, I think that's what it stands for. And nationally, we have the National Biodiversity Network that I referenced in my talk. And here in Cornwall, we have ERCIS. I can't remember what that stands for, but it's something involving Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly and the environmental data sources, basically. So we submit our data to both ERCIS and to National Biodiversity Network. And then from there on, anyone can access it at all. So it's free to download. I just downloaded the data that I showed you in that talk from the NBN itself. And they also feed it into GBIF. So it is something that people are working very hard on. I think in some ways, it's actually professional scientists that really need to pick up their game in this respect, because there's a lot of data out there that's been collected by professional scientists that's not on these portals. People feel like they have a competitive career advantage by holding on to it, which I actually don't think is true. I think that by making it freely available, you increase the interest in this data set, and you won't get out-competed because no one's got a better idea of the data than you have anyway. But that happens a lot, and so I think that could be something to be encouraged as well, getting more data put onto the portals. The portals are there.
And you mentioned the ERCIS data specifically around Cornwall. Am I right in thinking that the ERCIS data in effect is verified? You send in what you think might be a particular species, and somebody who is knowledgeable on that species then checks to confirm that it is. So there's a sort of quality control. Yes,
I think that's the case. That is the case with some of the other portals as well. The issue is that it's quite a time-consuming process to get to that stage. So I've had verifications come through like a year or so after they've been submitted, and I know some of the people that do this verification, and they have other jobs that they need to be getting onto as well, and they just have a backlog of records coming through. The good thing, as we talked about earlier, with things like smartphones, is that it does give the opportunity to do this verification. So you've got pictures of a lot of records that come in. But one thing that we sort of stress a lot is we do our verification in the Rockpool project, is that we verify the absences as well as the presences when people do a survey, which you can't do obviously from a photo. So to do that, if someone comes to us and they say they've completed the survey, these are the species that I found of crab, let's say, and then say, well, you sure you didn't find that one? And then you can have a conversation with them about it. That's more tricky to do with a purely online system.
Great, thank you. So this is, as you were saying, the scientists need to get involved in talking with the citizens to tap into this richness. Mm-hmm. Right, okay. You mentioned a colleague of yours called Alan who's commenting you on your sartorial sense.
He's full of compliments, that guy.
Alan, would you be interested in coming on screen, or are you a little shy to do that?
No, I'm happy to do that.
Ah, here he is.
Not looking too bad yourself, mate.
Not as smart as you, Ben.
So you can ask your question yourself then.
Thank you. Yes. Well, great talk, Ben. I just wondered, people, I can tell straight away there are lots of people here as passionate in citizen science and marine wildlife as us, probably even more passionate. And if they've got more spare time than normal, is there any way they could get involved with the Rockpool project at all, apart from perhaps rock pooling?
Yes, so we've got a lot of stuff in which we put a shout out on our last newsletter, as you know, Alan. So if people are interested in volunteering, if they do have spare time, we want to develop our website in terms of the information that's on there for people to access to learn more about the rockpool species that we have here in our local area. So if anybody's interested in doing that, or any other way, I mean, we are a fully functioning organisation by ourselves. We're not a side project of a larger organisation. We have a lot of volunteers who help us out on a regular basis. So if you are local, even if you're not, please give us a shout if you're interested in helping us out. We'd love to have you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Looking pretty smart yourself, I may say. We have Henry, who was here last week and asked some interesting questions. A comment rather than a question. This is on the biodiversity, citizen science, and accessing bugs in the garden. Anyone who has a garden can send details of bugs to the Bug Hunt online to collate where bugs are and how to get reports on what to look out for in your garden. Henry, that's brilliant. We are going to have a talk on insects in the garden. So as soon as that's up and running and we know exactly who it's going to be in the next couple of weeks or so, I believe. We'll get you back and maybe you can tell us a bit more about that, or maybe we can look it up in the meantime as well. So, excellent. People are coming in with more and more stuff. No immediate questions coming up, so I will, again, take the chair's privilege of asking another one myself. When we talk of citizen science, we tend to have the sort of French Revolution sense of who is a citizen, i.e. an individual with voting rights and so on. But outside of the formal science community, there are all kinds of other organizations whose knowledge of what's going on or whose resources and access we can tap into. I can remember going to Brittany ferries a year or two ago and fascinated by a notice that seemed to be, I can't remember the exact wording of this, so I may be wrong, anybody correct me please. They were attaching something to the side of the ferry which would gather, I believe, plankton or something which is naturally hoovered up as the ferry went to and fro. And it goes to and fro, regular as clockwork, week after week after week, year after year after year. And so the data that they were collecting there by sending in that information gave a picture on the changes in the biodiversity, certainly at plankton level. Now, that's not citizen science in the way we usually think of it, but it's ways that scientists can work with other sources of knowledge and other ways of gathering knowledge. Are there other, I mean, I found that wonderful. I just thought, I definitely like Brittany ferries. Are there other examples of that kind of working outside of the science community that you can that you know
That
of?
sounds like it was the continuous plankton recorder survey. Is that right?
That would fit my vague memory of what it was about. Yes.
So those guys they're based in Plymouth. They at the Citadel building with the Marine Biological Association, and that is probably the name mentioned it, one of the greatest examples of this kind of thing going for over 100 years, and ships have been using these continuous plankton recorders to produce excellent data that people have done some amazing things with, and particularly to sort of track the impacts of climate change on our marine communities. So I'm trying to think of something similar to that. So can I just get a feel for the distinction you're making between this and other citizen science programs? I'm not sure if I really.
I was making it up as I went along, but most people, when they think of sort of citizens, think of individual volunteers in groups, as against organisations who nevertheless can have a very, very valuable role. I see Sophie's already commented to say that yes, indeed, that is going on, and it's University of Plymouth that seems to be working on that. So perhaps we can try and talk to them and see if they can come and tell us more about it. But yes, that was the distinction I was making.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we work a fair bit with organisations ourselves, rather than we do work with individuals, but organisations as well. There are, I think that's quite often a good way of working, rather than having to sort of recruit a whole bunch of individuals separately. And one good thing about how we work is that it gives the activities we do. They are quite easy for organisations to fit in with what they normally do. So they can sort of tag it in if they're doing a beach clean, that kind of thing. They can tag in one of our surveys on the end of it. So we do have quite a few collaborations in that respect.
Okay, we've got a knowledgeable bunch at the moment. Sophie corrects me. The MBA in Plymouth is the main. Where's I've lost it? Where's it gone? The Maine Biological Association. Well, my geography is a bit rovey, but is there a Plymouth in Maine? Is there a Maine in Plymouth? Sophie, perhaps you can.
I think she's corrected herself. It's the Marine Biological Association.
Right. Okay. Meanwhile, again from Sophie, a charity called Orca that trains citizens to look out for marine mammals. So not just looking out for orcas.
Yeah, there's there are others as well that are focused on marine mammal sightings. There are people that actually go out on the ferries to do marine mammal sightings from there as well.
Mm-hmm. And we have quite a large yachting fraternity, yachting as well as fishing fraternity down here in Cornwall. I wonder if any of them would be interested in getting involved. Now, meanwhile, Heather Latas did a survey on cockles at Bar Beach on the Helford River. Is this of use for a comparison? Sounds good to me. Yeah, sorry, I did get your private message, Heather, on that, but I wasn't able to reply to it whilst I was chatting at the same time. But you say it's 20 years ago that you collected this data. Well, we haven't got any data we could compare it with at the moment from there, but maybe we could do a special trip to see how things have changed. It would be interesting. I went down. Is that the same beach where they did a thing on? Is it Easter time? I can't remember. Where they have the bank holiday thing where the commoners such as myself can go and collect cockles once a year. Is it May Day? Does anybody know? Can't remember. I did it myself a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it might be interesting to see what impact all this gathering has had on the cockles there. Mm-hmm. Now, Mahira points out another side to the story, that conservation and study is also about stopping us damaging and losing all the knowledge. Mahira, would you like to come on screen again and comment on this? You need to be unmuted.
Yeah, sure. So one of the points I just wanted to make about what I feel is the importance of documenting species in a city where it's not really been done publicly. is that on one of the very popular beaches, I see that there are quite a few species. I walk there and they're right there living on the sand. You don't even have to go near the water, they're like right there. And then the local city government allows dune buggies to like drive on the beach like almost 24 hours a day. I mean, these days it's been like 6 weeks. There's no one on the beach. People are banned from going there. So I'm very happy that I think that wildlife is getting a bit of rest from people, I would say. So I also run an animal welfare society, and we promote conservation and wildlife and urban wildlife especially. And I just feel I would be really happy if we generate this data, and then those buggies are banned from the beach. And there's one other thing I want to mention. I think we really need to educate our city authorities to like on some basic science, such as there are no people on the beach since like probably 6 weeks. We've been under lockdown, but they have these tractors that sort of flatten the sand. I don't know why, just near the road. And I have filmed. I'm a filmmaker, so like I just go and document. So I have filmed crabs, which are like this big, like big white ones. I'm not sure what the species is. They make their homes there, their burrows, and then these people are just flattening. I don't know what they're doing, and I want to tell them you should plant those creepers which are there naturally, but which they get rid of, and then they get these palm trees and try to plant them. But it sort of breaks my heart, and I don't think anyone realizes or just sees one, how lucky we are to have a beach in the city and with all this wildlife. And then I see all these things happening abroad, like you guys have so much good stuff going on as far as like scientific surveys and whatnot. And I really want to learn from you guys and bring something like that here.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. I'm sure you'll find many like-minded people well, it sounds like you probably already have, to help you out. So I hope that you have the success that you're looking for there. But what you're describing is something that happens all over the world. The city or town council seem to think that they know what a nice beach looks like, and they spend money destroying the ecology of it in order to make it look nice in their eyes. If you can do something, especially through citizen science, because as I mentioned in my talk, you're killing two birds with one stone. You're getting the data that you need, and you're raising the awareness you need. It only has to really be for one site to document how, if you can stop the buggies, for example, and then study the response from whichever species you think might be most impacted by the buggies. Sounds like humans might be quite impacted by the buggies. Doesn't sound very nice to me. Then once you've got the data and do the analysis and publish it, then just publish it online. You don't have to necessarily go through peer-reviewed stuff that professional scientists go through in order just to get the message out there. Then hopefully you'll get the kind of response that you're looking for.
Thank you.
Mahira, it strikes me that if you're a filmmaker, you are a powerful person. We live in a very visual culture these days, particularly a videoing culture. And if you got white crabs, that's a pretty photogenic character. I'd say the first step is to work out exactly what they are and get people interested in the lifestyle, the character. Where else are they seen? Get a white crab support community.
That would be great. I will work on it, and I'll be in touch with you guys. Yeah.
Thank you. Come back and let us know how it evolves. Make us a film, and then we'll see. Okay, I'm going to move us on because we have a couple more questions. Liam Shoesmith. Liam, very nice to speak to you again. Late in the group, so you might have missed this. No, actually, this question hadn't come up before. Is there a great change in pH, in acidity, along our coastlines, and what's been affected? Is there a discernible change at this stage?
Well, I mean, the pH of the oceans is the big concern, although it has kind of dropped off in terms of the concern towards it in recent years, kind of been replaced by a concern for the plastic situation, but it hasn't gone away. Ocean acidification, ocean becoming more acid due to the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How it varies along the coastline, and I guess when you say along our coastline, I don't know if you mean a national level. I don't know, to be honest. I won't try and blag the answer. I'm not sure. But it has the impact, particularly the change over time because of ocean acidification, affecting pretty much everything in the ocean. A lot of species create calcium carbonate to make shells or for their exoskeletons, and that's a chemical process that's hugely impacted by the pH of the environment that those species are living in. And no one really knows, as the ocean becomes more acidic, whether they're going to be able to adapt to carry on doing that. If they can't, even species which don't do that are going to be impacted because so many species in the ocean are going to be affected.
Chilling. Okay, I'm going to take us on to the next question from Sophie Walker of Sundhout. Do you notice a bias in your data? Now, this is referring to the citizen science studies earlier, where you found pretty remarkable similarities between the citizen science studies and the others. But depending on who does the study, I presume we're talking now about the quality, the characteristics of the study group, or the characteristics of the citizen scientists. Do you notice a bias of any kind? Can you identify, can you discern some people tending to veer one way or another?
There's definitely a lot of individual variation in just speaking most recently, the stuff we've done on the rock pools. Sometimes people will record 3 species in one of our surveys, and because we give people the opportunity to record whatever they find, as well as look at their target species, some people will record, like 30, 40 odd species on top of that. It's difficult to predict in terms of what type of person they're, what their background is, and it's only something that we do in our heads. We don't actually collect data on the demographics of the people taking part. Primarily because up until now we've just been conscious because of the data protection regulations that we have to have a nice clear reason for what data we actually do collect and keep hold of. But it wouldn't be something that we could do it provided we sort of explain to people that that's why we were collecting the data. So it's something that we could look at in the future. But it depends how what sort of comparison you're looking at. If you want to compare young people, old people, men, women, I don't know. But as we sit here, I wouldn't really like to say if a particular groups of people do things in a particular way. It's just a lot of individual variation.
Difficult to get a large enough study to be comprehensive enough to be statistically significant with any findings. Okay, we're back on the Helford with another question from Heather. Are there any restrictions to the gathering of cockles, winkles, mussels, and razor clams? Maybe that's and/or razor clams on Bar Beach by commercial gatherings of sackfuls of shells, and also using salt in large quantities?
Well, I'd be happy to look into that and get back to you, Heather, because it is part of a protected area. I think the fowl and the Halfords is a special area of conservation. And as I've mentioned when I spoke about protected areas and all these protected areas we've got around around Cornwall and Devon, they vary a lot in terms of what actual protection that is in place, and not hardly any of them are a situation where people aren't allowed to do any fishing or any kind of activities, which is what a lot of people think of as a marine protected area. I know within the fowl they did went through a long process where at one stage the government were being threatened to be taken to the European Court of Justice, I think, to restrict one type of fishing there, some of the dredging. But I don't know if that was in the Helford as well, and what the restrictions actually are in there. But the actual, if you look at the legislation that's put in place where for these special areas of conservation, which is what the Fowl and Health is, they basically say that you're not allowed to do anything that could possibly damage the particular habitats and ecosystems that have been designated, within that area as being special. And the habitats of the species that you mentioned there would come into that. And so really, if anybody wanted to take it further, there would be a case for saying that this sort of stuff shouldn't happen. But then you can guarantee that there'll be a big argument that this has been going on for years, and then there's economic interest. That it wouldn't be easy to actually push that through. But in theory, at least, if you look at the process that was it was a global process that happened to get these sites set up. That discussion should have already been had. That commercial activities should take place elsewhere. But as far as I know, there's no specific restrictions for the things that you're talking about at the moment.
But quite broad in terms of not doing any damage.
Yeah, I mean that's when the special areas of conservation were drawn up. It was as part of a response for this big global biodiversity debate. They asked countries around the world to set up areas, terrestrial and marine, to actually just protect and to consider the economic impacts when they made those decisions. And they did that, but then when it comes to actually interpreting that description of no damage, that's when the devil in the details come out, basically.
Yeah.
But this is another reason why I think it's important to get people involved in the process, because people aren't necessarily aware of that, and if they were, then maybe there'll be more pressure to actually have these sites better protected.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a slightly ambiguous, possibly comment, possibly question from Liam, with just the one word Cornwall. Not quite sure where you're going with that, Liam. Would you like to expand on that? Maybe come on screen if you wish, but I'm not quite sure where we what to make of that.
I think that was just to tie in with his earlier question about the pH along the coastlines.
Along the coast of Cornwall.
To specify that area. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. It's a bit tricky, isn't it, having to write quite a complicated question in a hurry. Okay, Amanda joining us from France. Oh, that's great. That's really nice. It's beautiful to see how international we can become with these things. We don't have any more immediate questions coming up. Ben, would you be interested in kind of summing up a little, or do you have any further observations you'd wanted to make and were hoping would come out at some point?
No, it was a really nice discussion. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I think one thing that came out with the question that you're asking, Robin, is sort of having somewhere where people can go to find out what citizen science opportunities are available out there. So I don't know if you guys would be interested in having a page on your website with a list of citizen science projects that people can get involved with. And I'll be happy to help put that together, so you can have that at people's fingertips, basically.
That would be brilliant, Ben. That was one of my kind of latent ambitions, that we may be able to find somewhere where anybody interested can look in and see what's around. There's also there's been an attempt by Age Concerns to do something called Cornwall Link, which is worth mentioning. I think they're still a little bit embryonic, but that's again for anybody who wants to participate in activities, particularly when they're good for their health, and they're particularly, granted it's Age Concern, they're particularly looking at the health of older people. And I'm very keen that we actually get science and citizen science projects into the general imagination as something that you might get involved with, part of the sort of social prescribing world. Okay then, David, can I just double check with you? Do we have any other more technical questions or comments that we wanted to make about the whole process, what we're learning, what we need to do?
Sure. I think just in general, if anybody, as this is a new format, doing these Cafe Side Talks remotely, if anyone does have any more feedback for us at this stage, just let us know. You should have our email, or you should be able to contact us through Eventbrite if nothing else. So yeah, if you do have any specific feedback pertaining to the format or the time of day, then please do let us know.
And it's also worth reminding people that Cornwall Science Committee, we have a committee, but our intention always was to have a larger membership. So if you go to the Cornwall Science Committee website and sign up, you can effectively join a part of this wider community. We're not sure yet where we're going with it and what we'll be able to do with it, but until we get people on board who we can talk with, we can't assess where we go next. But if you're interested in being more actively involved, then please do. So finally, I think the last thing then to do is to, the last but one thing to do is to mention next week's talk. We have, I believe, the world expert effectively on Humphrey Davy, the first president, I think, of the Royal Society, and one of the earliest exponents of public engagement with science, including citizen science, insofar as he experimented with laughing gas on himself and his friends. So that is going to be next week with Frank James from UCL, University College London. So another really nice example of how we can have people from outside the county able to come and give a talk here through the wonders of video and live streaming. So look out for that next week and for the rest of the program. If you are interested in being involved in being informed about more of these, on the Eventbrite page, you can click on follow, and that means that you then follow the Cornwall Society community events, and anything that we put on through Eventbrite, you will then get notification of. So it's a way of short-circuiting some of our more roundabout and circuitous communication channels as we gradually build up a presence. So hopefully we'll see some of you next week for that. In the meantime, we tried this last week and I think it worked really well. Cafe Side Talks always used to end up with a round of applause for our speaker. So if we unmute everybody. Hello. And so, can I suggest a round of applause for thanks for our speaker, Ben Holt.